Was the moon landing faked? Well, in this day and age, it pays to be skeptical. There are so many conspiracy theories swirling and then so many false presentations that it is easy to mistrust anything that is stated either on social media or on public television. And so it pays to be skeptical. Ever since the advent of television, we know that fiction has become a very powerful force, not just in our country, but in the world, to create storylines and presentations and to lead people along with these storylines, such as, in selling things to people. It is easy then to question, did we ever in fact go to the moon? You can also add to this that in the day and age we live in, it is more and more noted that many, many politicians are lying about things and covering things up. They have backdoor agendas and backdoor policies. And the same thing goes on in the corporate world, in the corporate sphere. These handshake deals that are happening between corporations and governments and contractors, etc. It's some nasty, wicked stuff, and we know that the truth is not always being told to the public. Not to mention that on social media, all you have to do is get on board any social media platform, and some sort of conspiracy theory is going to come your way in short fashion. Just pick and choose whichever one that you wish to get involved in. But to decide if landing on the moon was actually factual or not, we need to understand something about ourselves. We need to understand how to properly investigate. And one of the first things we have to do is ask ourselves the question, am I biased? Am I biased in any sense? This is a great question to ask in anything, in any endeavor you get into, is, am I biased? And if the information was new, such as, what do you think about this conspiracy down in East Africa? And if you don't know anything about East Africa and what's going on there, it would be easy to be unbiased. But considering this is about going to the moon, it's part of the historical record. It has filled our television sets from time to time. And there's always some kind of new controversy or angle concerning it. How are we supposed to approach this and not be biased? So the question is, am I biased? But also, how am I biased? And what is it that I wish to believe? You really need to consider that before you go in to investigating any of the facts around it. And any further level is, what do I want to believe? And with that, you should ask the question, why am I emotionally committed to this side of the fence? Why am I emotionally committed to it? And for most things in life, when we get into the argument section of arguing with another person, we just simply want to be right. I haven't met a human being that wanted necessarily to be wrong. And you get into an argument, and it is always to express, I am right in this argument. And so if there is a big debate about a conspiracy, we obviously don't want to be on the wrong side of the debate. So emotionally, I just want to be correct. Also, when it comes to some kind of big conspiracy that we have invested a lot of time into, hearing about it and discussing it, we at times do not want to be wrong about our stance and the way we see things, because it would be very, very painful to adjust. Not just in admitting we're wrong, but now I got to start thinking about things. And I kind of like the way I thought about them before. And it's hard to adjust. And if you have committed years of time to this, it might be terribly, terribly hard to adjust. I want us also to be aware of we need to be aware of some tendencies in our human nature of how we bias ourselves. And one is, I would call it information stacking, or supposedly fact stacking. Anytime we take a position on something, we obviously very rarely take a position because of one truth or one fact that we've had. We usually let them stack up. Do I need 2 or 3 facts? Do I need 10 or 15? And anybody that investigates something for a little bit of time is going to stack up some information about that event and say, hey, I've got this, and now I am somewhat of an expert in this area. Now, I wouldn't say expert in the professional sense, but in our own mind. And it's to the point where we say, I have done enough in this to come up with a solid foundational decision. And I rely then on the facts that I have stacked to prove me right. I would encourage you not to rely on the facts that you have stacked, but to weigh them in proportion with reality. Now with this, we also, a lot of times people will write off whether something is right or wrong because they're already familiar with the argument or the position of the other side. They're just familiar with it. And a lot of times they slap a name or a label on it and they have mastered it. Well, this is absolutely not the truth. There is more to such. You don't have something mastered just because you know the name for it. I understand, I have heard the term string theory, and I know a little bit about what that covers and indulges, but I have no idea all the depths and mastery of it. And so for me to try to take a position on it would be very, very difficult. So let's not say that we have mastered something or we're biased about something because we are familiar with a side of it, or because we have given, certain names to different categories of it. And it's something else that we typically do once we have biased ourselves and chosen a side. And this is something that I would call gatekeeping. So those on one side of a fence, let's say they have stacked 15 facts, and the other side has stacked 15 facts. There is no way to present all 15 facts at once because of time crunch and the ability to process information. Especially for guys, most of us can hear one idea at a time, give it to me straight in a line. But you cannot hand 15 facts at once. But for someone that has pre-biased themselves and they've already dug into their position and emotionally they are holding on to that position, when the other person says, well, here's my counterpoint, fact number one. The gatekeeper can look at all of his stack of information and say, well, I'm biased already. And as that person begins to share, and maybe the gatekeeper's a little familiar with that angle of it, they can start closing the door and they can say, I discount that fact. Click. So now the opposing party only has 14 facts to present. And so they have to go single file again. And so they present fact number two. And so as they present fact number two, the person is like, I've got 15 facts and that's sure. Everything I know outweighs fact number two. So surely fact number two is wrong. So now you have brought to me two erroneous facts and it's not looking good for you. What is it? Strike three, you're out. So the opposing party might bring fact number three. They bring fact number three in, and you look back at your stack of 15. You're like, fact number three just doesn't seem to check out because everything I know about this topic weighs against that one piece of information. And so the gatekeeper will keep out a storehouse of information by processing one little fact at a time. And if they feel like they have shut the other ones off effectively, they may keep the bulk of the information that actually might be true out of reach and out of range. And you just want to be aware if you're doing this or not. So are you biased? Are you information stacking? Do you claim that you know something just because you're familiar with it? Are you using gatekeeper syndrome to keep you from actually understanding the truth? Now, along with this, I really want you to come to grasp with the fact that in dealing with something like the moon landing, and if it was true or real, one of the questions we have to ask, one of the ideas that we have to understand is the closest we're ever going to get to this is going to be evidence that's presented, and you could choose a side on whether you accept it or not. We have to trust people and their presentation of it, trust, and then we have to go with the logic, the best it's logically presented. And all of that is, semi-shaky ground. If I can choose to accept evidence or not, or choose to accept somebody I trust or not, or choose logic or not, it's kind of shaky ground. And so we need to realize that we're always going to kind of be one step back from this. And we have to be careful in a balanced approach to such. Now, I want to share with you something that has been very helpful to me over the years in processing information. And how do I personally spot fakes. And I'll tell you this, it is not with the presentation. A presentation is not necessarily reality because some people are good at presenting lies. And so one thing that is very hard to do, though, is to set up what I would call tertiary or boundary items or subsequent items or cause and effect items that are on the perimeter. Someone can give you a fantastic story, but it is very hard for them to control the perimeter events from the story. And as an example, one thing that keyed off to me years ago is if someone was talking about another person and they continued to use proper name, proper name, proper name, proper name, I began to get the sense that they really didn't know the person that they were talking about, because typically human nature is to be a less formal and to drop into using pronouns such as, hey, I know so-and-so, he is a great guy. They don't say, I like Matt, Matt is a great guy. There seems to be a hint of falsehood to that, and there is an essence that truth carries with it. And one of the things I've noticed again is these tertiary items that can't really be controlled. And so I'll get to that a little more in a second. The other thing is some people want to say that because something is simpler, that it is necessarily the truth. And I want to say in this situation, I don't think that that completely holds up. Because there are times when you're talking about something situational that it is very hard to grasp the truth. Oftentimes when I'm talking to kids, they come in the door, so they're so excited, they're presenting an emotional reaction to an event, they're giving me all the highlights, and as they're feeding the information to me, it's complex, and I don't understand what's going on, and I don't quite grasp the picture, and the order seems discombobulated, and nothing's fitting together. And because it's complex, I don't go, hey, you're a liar. What were you really doing while you were out? That's not the approach I take. I actually begin to investigate it further until some of the puzzle pieces begin to become more clear. So just because something is complex doesn't necessarily mean it is wrong. And further, if a lie can actually be very straightforward, it can be very palatable and just easy to grasp. So I'd say if something's hard to understand, that doesn't make it not true. With this also, something I begin to look for when I'm trying to discern if something is true or false is, does it have natural difficulties to it? And this doesn't apply to every single scenario. But if someone is giving an elaborate and long story, does it have natural difficulties to it? You see, when you are crafting a story or a lie, you are crafting the main line, and it is hard then to craft difficulties. Now, everyone that is familiar with life knows that life has difficulties. That is one of the truths of life. And so these difficulties naturally arise, and it would take a master deceiver, super deception, to come up with difficulties in a storyline to make it seem more authentic. And that's not typically the way we operate. I would say, back to the original thought, it is very easy to add details, but it's almost impossible to add consequences. So now, personally, being exposed to the moon landing, I have heard some very interesting thoughts. Now, my position previous was that the moon landing was authentic, it was part of history, and people began to present me with some ideas that had me going, that's really interesting. And some of those had to deal with, rockets propelling themselves through empty space. Where did they get their oxygen from? And then with a little bit of investigation, I began to see that, there's a reasonable answer for such. Or a lot of the photographic problems that are presented, there's a reasonable answer for such. But then, does reasonable make right? And so, because this thing gets continued question again, I just want to approach it more from this angle. And let me give you 4 major points from a Christian perspective that should really help you see through this thing. So, number 1, Why in the world would NASA or the airwaves in general suppress Buzz Aldrin's Lord's Supper communion before they landed on the moon? Why suppress that? Now, if the conspiracy was to present a rocket ship shooting off through the atmosphere and traveling where no man has gone before, and we as America together are doing this, why would there be a need to suppress a story about a man wanting to do communion before he landed on the moon? You want to do communion with the other astronauts before they landed on the moon. Why would you need to suppress that story? As we talked about previous, it is hard to add consequences and details after the fact. If we're trying to paint a good image of ourselves, it is possible, and like I said, it could be master class deception to say that, oh, well, I'm going to release some bad information to help my good information look authentic. But this is typically not the way human nature works. In fact, I don't know that I've ever really met anyone that wants to paint themselves with bad pictures. And how then would NASA win with letting this out? We're trying to paint a good picture that we are going to the moon for everyone, for the entire world. But we want to tick off the Christian population with a story that's negative, that we suppressed the communion on board the vessel that took them there before they landed on the earth. Before they landed on the moon. And let's suppress that story. Let's send out this counter story in such fashion. Like that's not the kind of counter story you would actually concoct, because it would kind of take away from the original. That just kind of falls more in line with reality. Or if you don't want to go with that, then why in the world would Buzz, who was a committed religious man, why in the world would he then want to craft a lie about going to the moon? Or let it out that he was denied communion rights on the airwaves, like he could, like this logically, this is a very complex thing to explain if the moon landing sequence was all crafted. It just seems to fall into the scope of reality. Second thing is, why in the world was the lunar lander crafted to be more buoyant and floaty than just a landing object? So the discussion previous to creating the lunar landing module that actually set them down on the surface of the earth was that because of the millions of years of evolution that had passed, that the dust on the surface of the earth, by their calculations, could be up to 6 foot deep. And so it is possible that as the lunar lander, as it's getting close to landing on the surface of the moon, that they could sink into 6 foot of dust and then have all kind of issues, like how would they launch then, and how could they get out of the module, and how were they going to get back in, and could it take off again if its legs were so anyway, the legs, and this is very easy to see, just look up the legs, the lunar landing legs, and there's these big plates on the bottom of that are just really, really wide to help that lunar landing module not sink in the galactic dust that had collected on the moon over millions and millions and millions and billions of years. But when they landed on the moon, there was only a ½ inch of dust there. Probably because the world's only 10,000 years old. But, so why, if NASA was creating a story to make themselves look good, then why would they also paint a story to make creationism look more correct than evolution, especially if they were creating the Buzz Aldrin story to make themselves look bad? Like, that just isn't lining up with reality. Like, if they crafted this whole thing, why not make a whole bunch of dust where the thing was sinking down? Look, here's proof of evolution being correct. There's as much dust on the moon as we thought, but that was actually a disappointment to many that, oh, there's just barely a little bit of galactic dust there, and we need to change our theory about that. Further, there were reflector plates left in 4 different places on the moon so that those here on Earth could shine lasers and lights and frequencies at these plates on the moon and get them to bounce back to the Earth so they could take measurements and soundings and do science stuff. And why then, when they set these things up, were they just so inferior? Like, if the whole thing is fake, then why in the world did they have such problems when they send these frequencies off that they can't get a lot of the frequencies to come back? I mean, they know where they're aiming. They're aiming at the moon, but it's all fake. And so those frequencies should immediately come back, and every time, but they don't. Further than that, the frequency bouncing back gets worse. It's gotten worse over time. And in the past 50 years, it has gotten a lot worse, probably because of the dust that's, getting on the surface of it or whatnot. But if you were crafting a lie, why wouldn't you have like all these amazing readings that were just coming in immediately? Like, we set these reflector plates up there, and but nothing's coming back. Like, that paints them. We made it to the moon, but we're not good enough to set up reflector plates. The stories are conflicting. That would be 3 stories that are conflicting against NASA's image instead of it just kind of being real problems. Along with that, the reflector plates show that the moon is leaving Earth's orbit at about the rate of a fingernail's growth per year. So each year, the moon gets farther and farther away from us, kind of like it's going out of our orbit slowly by these measurements. Now, that doesn't bode well for evolution either. And NASA, they're like one of the protectors of evolutionary things. Why would they do that? Because if you start backing the moon up, it eventually collapses into Earth's orbit and causes all kind of chaos with the oceans and tectonic plate shifting. So there's too much gravity, and it would throw us out of orbit, most likely, since Neil deGrasse Tyson says the orbits are all unstable, etc. Like, that would not work. If the moon's getting farther away now, that means it was closer in the past, and you just can't rewind things by more than 1 million years without having some serious issues. So why would NASA craft a story and then screw up all of that? Which it just does not seem logical in any stretch of the imagination. So from a biblical viewpoint also, I would like to mention that the scripture says quite clearly that nothing is hidden that won't be revealed. So even in the last year or so, with, let's say the last 2 years, with all of the garbage that has gone on across the globe, Epstein's Island couldn't remain hidden. You've got FBI whistleblowers, you've got medical whistleblowers, you've got whistleblowers coming out from Google AI. Like, these whistleblowers come out even while the events are pretty fresh. But here, since 50 years have passed since we landed on the moon, there's no whistleblowers. No one has stepped forth. All of the attacks, I'm not going to say all the attacks because I'm not a professional in that, but the attacks are coming from the outside. And a lot of them sound very reasonable, like, attacking the pictures because the shadows don't do this, that, or the other until you look up the other side of it. And they sound reasonable, but there's not whistleblowers coming forward. And most of them would be near death or dead at this point. And why wouldn't they want to share their story now about the things that they did? And do you understand the complexity of hiding a lie from 400,000 people in an organization? Like, it could be done, it can be done, it is done, but keeping it hidden would be nearly impossible. So from a Christian standpoint, I think it's very evident that we, in fact, did go to the moon. Now, is NASA telling us the truth about climate change? That's a totally different story.